Thank you very much for having me here today. I'm just going to put up some slides and I'll look to Claire. Claire, are you able to see the slides?
I can.
Excellent. Great. Thank you. And I just was noting the participants as people were joining. So good morning, everyone. I noticed one of my classmates, William, is on the call. So William, no hard questions today. Okay. You got to go easy on me, buddy. So welcome. So my conversation this morning will be on now you've got a strategy, so what? What's next? I'm going to start by just acknowledging that I'm on the traditional and unceded territories of the Lekwungen-speaking communities, Lekwungen-speaking families, in what's now known as Victoria, and that's the Esquimalt and Songhees nations. And I acknowledge the stewardship of the lands and surrounding waters since time immemorial, and I'm grateful to be able to live and work here in this community. Claire gave a bit of an intro of me, so I'll skip over some of the academic credentials, but my current role is in healthcare. I work in support services, and I have a team that provides support to healthcare operations in both acute and long-term care settings. I used to work at National Defense, and while I was working there, I became a huge strategy. When I say huge, it's the nerd part, not the big part. But in about 2003, I really started to study strategy as a primary focus and became really, really interested. So hopefully you'll find some of today's conversation interesting. If not, each slide should have a picture. Almost every slide should have a picture, so enjoy the pictures. I'm just going to acknowledge that I'm here as a volunteer and I'm not representing any organization. All of the comments and views that I'll share today are my own views. They're not attributable to any organization I'm affiliated with. And the content I'll present is largely based on my academic work. It's protected by copyright, and I do have relevant academic references available if anybody would like to know of them. So just a quick, maybe if you can put in the chat, you have opportunity to type into the chat just who's here today. What industries are you from? Specifically, I'm interested, which parts of the world, where are you joining from? And if you could just add a comment in the chat about which industry or type of organization you're with. And as you're doing that, I'll just, I've got the window showing both the faces for those who've got their cameras on, but also the chat. I'm going to ask a question as you're typing about who's here. What's been your experience of strategy? Is there anybody? Oh, fiduciary services from Bermuda. Wow, we should talk. I think I need to go and have an in-person meeting there. Good morning, Barbados, on my way. Ottawa, I've been to Ottawa. I'll go to Barbados instead. So welcome. Just for people who've got your camera on, if there's somebody, you know, do you think that your experience with strategy is strategies generally match the extent, the results that were intended? Have you seen strategy implementation just go swimmingly well and everything works great? I've given kind of 5 categories here. You know, it's category A, if you believe strategies are clearly articulated and fully realized in most organizations or in your own experience. B, they're somewhat clear and partially realized. C, they're somewhat clear but not realized. The results that are expected are not realized. D, the strategies are usually a bit unclear and somehow miraculously they get fully realized. Or E, strategies are a bit unclear and not realized at all. Has anybody got a comment or just a point about their experience of strategy? Just something to say whether or not, well, my presentation is going to make the premise that they're not usually very well executed, but I'm interested to hear if, Janice, you've got your hand up there. Janice, has your experience been that strategy is just amazing and it always works?
No, absolutely. Because the strategic plan is based on the future. So even the most clearly articulated, which is what I love to see, you know, as a board member, as a consultant, whatever. But at the end of the day, what really happens is never what you expect to happen. So that's why I'm sitting here today. I want to hear what you have to say about that.
Thanks, Janet. And we're going to spend a little bit of time, probably in the second half hour, we'll get to it, on about clear articulation and sense-making translation and how people interact with strategy. So very excited to have that conversation with you. Clear but never fully realized. Yeah, I put in simple terms, plain language as a challenge. It can absolutely be. And in fact, we'll talk a little bit, not just about language, but about understanding. So really good points. Is there anybody else who has a comment on strategy implementation where they say, boy, yeah, we nailed it. Everybody else should learn from us, or no, actually, there is a little yet to learn in this field. Okay, if you have a chance, maybe put it in the chat. Otherwise, I'm going to just move on. And actually, I just kind of mentioned my premise is that most organizations fail to realize the objectives that they set out in their strategies. Sometimes a pie in the sky where it's too far to attain. It can be absolutely. This research is quite dated, but in 2008, there was research that showed over 80% of organizations that had taken the effort to develop and implement a strategic plan reported that the strategic goals that were set out in their plan did not accrue, they did not materialize. And in fact, in many cases, the effort of designing and implementing the strategy went so far as to hamper or impede existing activity or ongoing operations. So the act of making the strategic plan actually became, in some cases, a distraction for the organization. I want to spend a bit of time in today's conversation talking about, strategy from 4 dimensions: the process, which is the planning the strategy, then strategy formulation. We'll spend a little bit of time on sort of strategy theory and approaches. I'm going to spend the majority of my time on implementing and monitoring, because I find that that's the part of strategy that is most often overlooked and usually is the difficult part. Tyrus here said the eyes are biggest than the stomach. Yeah, too many goals and too many objectives. That's right. And so when we get to that sweet spot between formulation and implementation, I think there's a lot we can learn there. Implementation and monitoring. I'll have a little bit of time for questions and then some closing and contact information. And then I'm going to just recommend that there's, I think, more than 40 people on the call today. For each of you, you'll get the most out of today's session just taking the parts that you can relate to or that you can feel a connection with your current experience, your current role. But what I'm going to present today is very generic. It's not not meant to be prescriptive or applicable to every organization. So there'll be some parts where you say, well, that doesn't really fit for me, and other parts where you'll say, oh, yeah, I can see that. So I talked about 4 things: planning. Planning is the process for making strategies. Formulation is making the strategies. Implementation is doing the strategies. And then monitoring, and usually you might see monitoring and reporting together. That's reporting and adjusting the strategies. And they all need to fit together. Janice asked, will I distribute my slides? Janice, I will send to Claire after. And when I say after, I mean probably around the 27th during the holidays. I'll take some time to trim them down a little bit because there's a lot of words here. And they'll happily send out a little slide and info package. But some of what I'll cover today is just a bit wordy, so I'll probably slim them up. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to start off with part 1, which is planning. And planning is it's kind of an essential part of making the strategy, and it's something that I feel very often people don't give enough sort of enough attention to, kind of jump right into planning. But there's a few things in the making of strategy that are going to have a very direct influence on the implementation, on its implementability. So we saw earlier here, the eyes are bigger than the stomach, too many goals and objectives. So in planning, you have to understand what the organization's needs are, and then different approaches to strategy. So I'm just going to start off with very, very simplified view. Strategy is, very simply, it's an intention to achieve a goal. It's an output. It's a thing you have, or it's a practice, a thing you do. And then very simply, again, strategy communicates a direction. But let's look a little deeper. The classic purpose of strategy. So in the 50s or so, strategy became sort of in vogue in the management literature and organization literature. And strategy has classically been viewed as something an organization has. It's a plan. It's a value proposition from Porter's work. It's about alignment, aligning the work of the organization. And then Kaplan and Norton famously with the balanced scorecard, starting in the early 2000s, but prominently in mid 2000, it's about measuring, monitoring, and controls, and of course, alignment and relationship. Classic strategy planning saw the act of making a strategy about taking a strategic stance, whether you're a prospector, a defender, an analyzer, or a reactor. That's Miles and Snow's sort of seminal work from the 70s. It was about, setting your mission, vision, values, determining your competitive advantage, identifying areas of differentiation, conducting an internal and external analysis. You're probably familiar with the SWOT analysis. Strengths and weaknesses are internal, opportunities and threats are external factors, and then PESTLE to look specifically at the external factors. Mintzberg in the mid-90s really challenged the classic view to say, well, there is an emergent component. Sometimes your strategy needs to be responsive. So making a strategic plan and putting it on the shelf might not help. And then Lawrence and Lorsch in the 60s, and then throughout, right through the 2000s, there was quite a bit of conversation about integration of the components, alignment, and fit. These are all led to development of approaches, methods, and tools. And you can find actually that there's many iterations of different strategy tools, strategy approaches, and strategy methods that you can find. But despite all those approaches, methods, and tools, strategy continually isn't implemented, and the results continually don't accrue to the organization as planned. Just unpacking a little bit more, the classic view of strategy was about setting a vector. So a vector has both direction and magnitude. So a direction, we're going to grow, our company's going to grow, or we're going to decline. We're going to be a leader in our industry or a follower. We're going to be fast moving or slow moving, conservative or risk taking, harvesting or sowing. We're going to invest more and grow, or we're going to reap the benefit of our investment. We're going to expand or contract, or we're going to attack and defend. You see these binary or the polar positions about a classic direction. And then, of course, how much will you grow? How much will you decline? How much market share will you take? How fast will you move? How much expansion will you do? There was always this idea of direction and magnitude. Slightly more contemporary view, starting in the 2000s, saw instead that you had very many successful organizations whose strategy might not even be well articulated. It might be sort of emergent, it's contextualized. It was more focused on the right product or service in the right place with the right quality at the right time. So contextualized. And in fact, many of those more contemporary approaches to strategy ignore or minimize the view of competition. And those strategies are more focused on outcomes or needs. They're seen as adaptive, and they recognize that that business need not be zero-sum or organizations. And you see this particularly relevant in the service sector or not-for-profits. Like I'm in healthcare, in Canadian healthcare that's publicly funded. In many cases, competition is irrelevant. We don't do a strategic plan about gaining market share. In fact, we would prefer that people would be healthy and stay home. We don't necessarily desire a lot more customers. In fact, wellness would be the better goal. So there has been a bit of a shift in thinking from the classic sort of structural, mechanistic, rational, economic-based views to a more contemporary view that sees it as strategy development as emergent and contextualized. So just another, maybe just put in the chat if you're more comfortable with the classic views, if any of those resonate with you, or maybe you're more comfortable with the contemporary view, or you can put A if you're more comfortable with classic, or B if you're more comfortable with contemporary, C if you say, actually, Michael, you're full of beans. I'm not really interested in either of those, and you're mostly wrong. Or D, it's a little of both. Tara says D. Any others? Yeah, D, a little of both. Yeah. D, yeah. And in fact, I think we've seen 3 Ds there. So the sense you have in academic literature about strategy and in strategy theory, you can see a sense of convergence in both classic and contemporary, where people are recognizing that the sort of the binary perspective that predominated the 50s, 60s, and 70s, it's either or, has now shifted to it may be either or, but it has to be contextualized because absent context, your strategy is very likely useless. So, looking ahead, when you're making your plan for how you will develop your strategy, one of the key things that you'll hear about is alignment, and we'll talk a little more later, but also you hear about engagement. And there's a premise that, the better understood, and we saw that, I think, from some of the comments in the chat, that if people can understand a clearly articulated strategy, then you have a much better chance of implementing that strategy. And so there are different approaches to strategy making. Sometimes you'll see it be facilitated. You'll bring in an outside resource who can help guide the process. Sometimes it's entirely organic, and it might not even follow sort of the classic textbook or the contemporary approach to strategy development, but being organic, that it involves many in-house stakeholders or interested parties. You have sort of well, it's an organic process. So facilitated is somebody tells you how. Organic is you figure it out on your own. Sometimes you'll see top down. Sometimes you'll see bottom up. Sometimes you see high levels of engagement. Sometimes you'll see strategy development as directive, like tell us how you'll achieve these goals. Sometimes it's collaborative. Tell us which goals you think we should achieve. One of the challenges I see quite often in strategy, and especially related to implementation, is often strategy making is treated as episodic. It's something that happens once a year or once a quarter, or once every 2 years, and you might have a quote from 30 Rock. It's a bit of a dated show now, but they had an episode about a strategic retreat to go forward, and I thought, isn't that fun? A strategic retreat to go forward. That's where everybody from the leadership team heads off to do something fun and have sandwiches and set the direction, and then make a pretty package that sits on a shelf. Other organizations treat strategic planning as ongoing, and you can tell by slight bias here. Later on, we'll talk about some of the advantages to ongoing. One of the approaches is outside in or inside out, and so these are two sort of classic views of strategy. A resource-based view looks at what resource do we have internally that will enable us to compete, and how do we organize those resources to compete effectively? And then the structure conduct performance review process is actually the reverse of that. It's what is going on in the external environment and in our external context that we need to address, and how do we align our resources to address the external context? So outside in or inside out. This is, guys, another question like the other one with the A, B, C, and D. I think it's both. I think you need to have both an inside out view and an outside in view. Otherwise, you're going to miss some pretty important context. And then one of the few articles I'll specifically refer to, but Mitchell, Aggle, and Wood in '97 wrote an article on stakeholder salience, and they identify that there are 3 different categories of stakeholder: those that have power to influence the change or the activity, those who have legitimacy, and those who have urgency. And they go through the different combinations that you have: somebody who's got power and legitimacy but no urgency, and then vice versa, somebody who has no legitimacy but no power. And they go through the different types of stakeholders. I think one of the things I like about that is that it unpacks the importance of having, and I'll keep using their term stakeholder, but I think the more appropriate term is like interested parties. So their view was that you need to consider the power, legitimacy, and urgency of each stakeholder. And the only fault I found with that is that they ignore the temporal component, and that people's interests will change over time. So if you have a chance, you might just search on Google Mitchell, Aggle, Wood, and stakeholder salience. It's definitely something worth a look at. So we covered strategy planning, right? Different approaches, the classic view, the contemporary view. And once you understand the approach that you'll use for strategic planning, then you're going to formulate your strategy. And so we're not going to go step by step through, but there's a few pieces I think that are important and relevant to formulation that need to be included, so that later on when you're thinking implementation, you'll have a sense of how things are working. So, formulation, historically, identify the mission, vision, and values of the organization, do internal analysis and do an external analysis. But the precursor to that is work fit.
We need to understand what kind of organization are you making a strategy for? Are you a manufacturing organization or information, maybe retail sales? You're a supplier, you provide services. The industry you're in will have specific hallmarks that will define and constrain the types of strategies that will be successful. So as an example, if you build mining equipment, you probably realize that you're going to, have very few sales per year. It's going to be very capital intense, and you're going to have like a supply chain that is critically important to keeping material flowing. And then if you're in retail sales, you want inventory turns, and you might have a small disruption in your supply chain, but you're probably going to have a whole bunch of different suppliers so that you have variation in the commodities or goods that you need to be able to bring to market. One is very, very cash intensive, and one is very, very cash flow intensive. Capital intensive and cash flow intensive. So you can see the different type of organization is critically important to the strategy formulation. Of course, which type of corporate form you're making the strategy for, whether you're a sole proprietorship or a partnership or not-for-profit, the type of form will influence the type of strategy that you'll need to make. And then the stage of development of the organization, these are only 3 different kind of dimensions, but they're just to situate that you need to consider strategy formation in the context of the organization you're making it for. So a startup strategy is probably going to be very, very different than, an institutional. So, a 3 or 4 person startup company is probably going to have quite a different strategy than a bank that's been mature and around for maybe 100 or 150 years. So the strategy needs to fit when you're making the strategy formation. If it doesn't fit, we'll talk a little bit about sense making shortly, but if it doesn't fit, you will have this natural tension between people being able to conceptualize the strategic goal and how to implement it. If it doesn't fit for the organization, it's like trying to run a marathon in high heels. It really hurts, trust me. Come on, somebody laugh. All right. Strategy formation, external analysis. It's really important to acknowledge the external environment and develop your strategy in ways that recognize the relevant points of it for your organization. The external factors are things that you don't control. And so since you don't control them, you need to respond to them. And I use 2 models, the PESTEL, which is the familiar one, political, economic, societal, technological, environmental, and legal. That's the PESTEL part. And then CI, cultural and information. Or else one that is from the military, typically it's political, military, economic, social, information, infrastructure, physical environment, and time. I just show the 2 because the military one is, it includes both the physical environment and time. And I think that sometimes in the PESTEL, that's a little bit overlooked. And I'm not saying these are the only 2 methods of external analysis, but if you're doing your external analysis and you look at your organization's ability to be impacted by any of those things, but then also your ability to address them as they emerge, or address, for example, a regulatory change. Could you respond to a regulatory change? Could you respond to proliferation of misinformation? Could you respond to a change in the physical environment? Is there some kind of key infrastructure that you're dependent on? Maybe you lose a roadway or communication link. The external analysis also should consider a competitive landscape. If you're considering that competitors are relevant, in some cases they're not, but you might look to, who else is in this space? What are they doing? Do they appear successful? Do they not? And then, of course, a market analysis. What are you preparing your organization to be able to do or satisfy? So your strategy formulation will think about fit and context, and then it'll look at an external analysis. You don't have to do them in this order, but there's certainly the elements that you need to do. The key thing, I'm going to say this here and I'll say it again a couple of times, but doing the analysis isn't the end. If you identify a key political factor that could influence your organization's ability to implement its strategy, later on, you have to introduce some tests to confirm whether or not that political change has happened. If it has happened, have your planning assumptions materialized? So these external analysis factors, or the factors you identify in your strategy formation process, are going to follow you all along through to implementation. Because if you guess wrong about a technological change and you've got a strategy that's dependent on that guess, then later on you're going to probably have to adjust your strategy either to make up that the change didn't happen, or refine it so that you've either changed the time frame for the technology implementation or you've negated the impact of it. So just to say, these factors, it's not a simple activity of just capturing them and then considering them and then putting them on the shelf. They're going to be in your pocket through your whole strategy journey. And then, like the external analysis, you have internal analysis. This, like, I have like a little, it's not a mnemonic or anything. I just always think to myself, IT, operations, HR, finance, research and development, marketing, governance, legal, risk. I just kind of list through the different departments within the organization or the different components within the organization. And I think, what is our ability to mobilize those internal resources or those capabilities towards whatever our strategy is? So one I use commonly is, like, I just call it a capability fit index. So, you know, our information technology capability, you know, it's somewhere between 0, we don't have one, and 5, it's perfect for our need. And so when you do that internal assessment, you say, well, you know, we're going to introduce a new technology and it's going to be dependent on, I don't know, some networking infrastructure. And our network infrastructure is dated. It's from 2005. So I would say on capability fit, that would be a relatively low fit. So maybe I score it a 2. But that doesn't mean I have to have a 5. It means I have to have something better than 2. And it's identifying just your ability. Now, sometimes people would use a SWOT analysis, but just because this is internal, it would be the strength and weaknesses component. So a strength-based approach. Sometimes it would be a weakness-based approach. I prefer a capability fit rather than specifically strength or weakness, because it allows you to inquire more deeply the relevance of the strength or the why it matters. So again, IT, HR, ops, finance, research, development, marketing. This is not an exhaustive list, but if you've got divisions within your organization that are responsible for certain things, very likely that those are good headings to use in terms of your capability assessment. So if you have a payroll department, you probably want to assess your payroll department's capability. If you have a logistics department, you want to probably assess your logistics department capability in the context of your future strategy, in the context of your goals. So strength-based or weakness-based, sometimes people will say development-based instead of weakness. Okay. I mentioned before with the external analysis, I'm going to just really reiterate it here. When you've done your fit analysis, your context analysis, your market analysis, your competitor analysis, when you've done your external factors and your internal factors, you need to make sure that you're keeping notes and you're recording the analysis. You're recording all of the assumptions that you've made about those factors. And you need to record everything you can about the decisions that flow from those factors. Because when it comes time to implement those strategies or achieve the goals, if you have a mismatch between the planning context and the actual context, automatically your strategy won't work. So when you've done the work on your strategy formulation, and you've collected the planning factors, the planning assumptions, and the contextual factors, just make sure that you keep those top of mind. We're going to hit this again in reporting and monitoring. We talked about clear, concise communication. Oopsie, sorry, I've wheeled my mouse there and it jumped. We talked about clear, concise communication or articulating the strategy. And I think we're going to talk a little bit about language, sense making, and understanding. But I think one of the things that's often overlooked is when people make their strategy, they've worked with it a few times. And I'm thinking like top management and possibly the board. You've worked with the content a few times. And so you'll come up with a bit of an internal shorthand about a specific strategic objective or goal. And you'll all have had a shared understanding of the planning assumptions. The problem is the people who are receiving that strategy to implement it very often are disconnected from those planning assumptions and the context. So I would suggest communicate more broadly than just here's our objective. Here's our objective, and these are the planning assumptions that contributed to the development of that objective. And where it's possible, it's not always possible, but where possible, seek feedback from people who are closer to the work on their thoughts about your understanding of the context and the validity of your planning assumptions. That conversation can often be very, very insightful. And then the last section, I think, for me on strategy formulation is that you need to end up with some result from it. And so your strategic plan will often end up with some goals or objectives. I think it's important when you're stating those goals and objectives. We talked about communicating the context, but also clarity. And I saw this in the comments earlier in the chat. Clarity. The simple approach I use is who will do what, by when, how much will it cost, what will the expected result be, how will you know if the result is met, and how will you measure progress? I think those are good questions to ask. And when I think about specifically the Chartered Governance Institute of Canada, the role of the board member, when you're looking at the strategic plan and you're looking at sort of the reports on operations, these are good questions to ask. So who will do what, by when, how much will it cost, what's the result, how do you know if the result is met, and how will you measure progress? I'm not saying these are the only questions, but if you're asking these questions about strategic goals and objectives, you want to get a good sense of what's in them. If you've participated in the contextual analysis, then you'll have that in your pocket. But if not, you'll want to unpack how were these goals formulated and why were they selected? Why this and not that? I like to use a very simple logic model to describe the activity of an organization. And I know there's many, many logic models. This one is just a shorthand for me that I like. There's a demand for some service or good or activity. There's a demand. And to meet the demand, you use some resource, and the resource transforms the resource by doing work, and you have an output. So, demand, I'm hungry. Resource, a loaf of bread, some peanut butter, some jam, and a knife and a person to move the knife around. The work, spreading peanut butter and jam onto the bread. The output, a sandwich. The outcome, I'm not hungry anymore. So, the logic model is super helpful for just identifying how does the strategic objective meet the demand, apply resources, monitor work, achieve an output, and of course that output contributes to an outcome. The trouble with this model is that in practice, it's super, super easy to measure a resource. How many people did how much activity? How many units of input goods did you use? How many pieces of bread? How much peanut butter? How many Michaels moving the knife? Easy to measure resource. And then we often use our output, how many sandwiches did you make, as a proxy for demand. Well, I made 3 sandwiches and everybody's full, therefore I needed 3 sandwiches. Well, are they overfull or are they underfull? Did they have a glass of milk? So we use output as a proxy for our demand, and we use resource as a shorthand to describe the work. So there is a little bit of nuance to how you use this logic model, but I do find these 5 dimensions are kind of helpful to understand operational work, especially linked to strategic outcomes. And then one thing, again, I feel that my experience of working in strategy is quite often overlooked, is the under-articulation of what you shouldn't do. In your strategic planning, as you're formulating goals and objectives, necessarily you're saying we will do this, but we will not do that. So if I'm going to Whistler, I'm going to Whistler, but I'm not going to Las Vegas at that same time. So sometimes people have an expectation that you're going to do something that you're explicitly not, based on the choices that you've made in your strategic plan. So when you consider planning context, fit, type of organization, plus internal analysis, plus external analysis, then you set your goals and objectives. Sometimes it's important to say, by doing this goal, we're not doing that goal. Or we're not doing that goal this year, we're going to do that next year because there's a temporality or sequence. How many goals is a good number, Janice? How long is a piece of string? It actually depends, and I know that's the classic accounting answer, but so the organization I'm in is 30,000 people, and we have 40 strategic goals. We have a strategic framework with 4 overriding goals, and then we have 40 specific strategic objectives. But community health is a completely separate program than acute care health. They are interrelated in that they both serve a patient population, but the work that we do in community and promoting wellness and the work that we do in acute care, responding to people's urgent care needs, they're different work. So I can have like a labor relations type goal or a human resources type goal. I can have a cost containment type goal that's overarching, but programmatically, it's important that the goals are relevant to the line of operations in a way that they can be implemented. So large, complex organizations, you might have more. Small organizations, you might have fewer. It also depends on how you stratify the definition of goals. Some people think goals are sort of the big overarching things that we should achieve, and they're quite loosely defined. And other people would say, my goal is that I want to make $10 next week, and I want to make $20 next week is a different goal. So I can't answer prescriptively. What I can tell you is that, and we're going to come to it in sense making, there is a threshold for human capacity for thinking about things. So if you put 42 goals, you better find some way that you can parse them out to make them relevant to people so they can connect to them. And we're actually going to cover that specifically as a pitfall in strategy definition. My last thought on, excuse me, on goals. Goals are often prepared, words mean something exactly, and symbols mean something. We're going to come like right to that next section, part 3. So this is just a Michael thing. I don't know why I think of this, but when I think of a goal, people say, oh, does the goal achieve the stated strategic objective? And they're like, well, yeah, it's great. This is a great goal. But when you think about the elements of the goal so that you can communicate it, there's some subcomponents, and I call them the gates. When you're bringing the information, first gate it has to pass through. Is it complete? Because if it's not complete, don't bring it to me. I can't use it. So if it's complete, then if it's complete but it's not accurate, there's something materially wrong with it. Well, you need to refine that because it's not accurate. And then is it logical? Does it make sense in the context? Is it feasible? Is it even possible? And specifically considering dependencies on external factors. So I worked with an organization. They had an amazing goal, and they wanted a specific human resource to join their team, but I'll say an astronaut, okay? So they made a beautiful HR strategy about how they're going to do knowledge transfer and implementation of a new program. And the key thing we need an astronaut. And so okay, well, are there any astronauts available in the labor market? Yeah, none exist. There's none in Canada. You can't have one. So you got this goal, it's complete, it's accurate, and it makes sense, but it's not actually possible. There are no astronauts to be had. So if it doesn't pass those 4 gates, it doesn't matter if it achieves the strategic objective. So when thinking about how you'll communicate your goals, is it complete, accurate, logical? Is it feasible? And then does it achieve the strategic goals? Wow, we're whipping along. I'm going to go pretty quick here on the next bit. We're at about 40 minutes. So I'm going to skip over the board's roles and strategy. If you're a management board, then you're going to be pretty active. And if you're a governance board, you probably won't. So I'll skip that. You guys know what boards do on strategy. Implementation, you've got your strategy, now what? So I want to go past this. Who implements strategies? It's middle managers. Now, middle manager is defined for this conversation just as somebody who's not a top manager, meaning not an executive, and then not a frontline worker. There's somebody who's got responsibility for the work of another and also not directly involved in direction setting and oversight. So that's a pretty broad, you might be a coordinator, a manager, a regional manager, a director, executive director. In some cases, executive director would be the top, but middle managers are the people that actually link the strategy to operations. But there's assumptions about middle managers. First, that they have the ability to do it, that they know how, they understand what the strategy is. Sometimes they were involved in development, sometimes not. That they're motivated to do it, and that the incentives, that there are incentives for them to implement the strategy. Middle managers have agency, and we'll come to that shortly, and then rationality. There's a lot of research since about Herb Simon in the 50s, and then later on a lot more. And there's the textbooks assume that people make bounded they make economically rational decisions in business and in strategy implementation, that people will act mechanistically and do the thing that makes the most economic benefit to the organization. But the reality is that they don't. I mean, people don't operate as automatons. They have agency. So the big gaps: classic views of managers understate agency. They assume rational actions will follow directly from understanding. They assume competency, and they assume that the system supporting the manager or that the manager interacts with operate effectively or correctly. Agency. The manager is close to operations, has better insight into the operations than the person who formulates the strategy, than the top manager. So the vice president, who's disconnected from operations, has very little insight into the day-to-day operations. Now, they might have grown up through there and they might have some insights, but generally, the person who's closer to the work has more fidelity of information about the work. So there's necessarily going to be a translation activity there. But middle managers are rarely the decision makers in strategy formation. And so just in the act of forming the strategy, identifying the strategic goals, you've sort of disconnected from the operations. And so performance expectations are often delinked from the strategies. And of course, the performance operational context is entirely relevant to strategy implementation. So management has typical views of the role of manager, you know, the classic views of planning, organizing, staffing, directing, controlling, planning, reporting, monitoring. Weber talked about bureaucracy and the hierarchy of accountability. Taylor from the 20s talked about scientific management and there being one best way. The traditional expectation of managers from 100 years ago, in fact, in many cases, more than 100 years, those are still often the mindset about what managers' activities will be, is that they'll follow these very classic, very ingrained views of what managers do. And they are all based with an underlying, not all of them, many of them are based with an underlying assumption of competence, that people are actually able to do every aspect of their job. The managers interact with systems. So if we consider that an organization is a complex adaptive system, it's a system. You develop models to describe the system, and then you build technology and business systems. I know it's the word defining the word, but they're different things. The business system is like your accounting system or payroll system. But you can see that the models themselves are already simplifications of the system. So you've got a manager with an incomplete understanding of the strategy. You've got a system that is a model, which is an abridgment of like a business system that's an abridgment of the organization, of the overall system. So you've got a gap in understanding, you've got a gap from formulation in translation, then you've got a gap that arises from use of systems that either enable or constrain based on a simplified understanding of the operational context. So you can see that we're starting to add noise at each level of the organization as we get closer and closer to operations and further from strategy formation, we're having more and more noise. The administrative technologies or business systems, they might be things that like HR systems, IMIT systems, financial systems, and they're guided with rules and policies. And those are meant to both enable and constrain middle managers' actions. And so when you think about rules and policies are based again in models of systems and business technologies. And so you've got this case where you might have a strategic objective about human resource management or about expansion, but your financial system is geared towards the old way of doing business. Your HR system might be geared towards the old way of doing business. And so you can have these systems that are meant to enable operational delivery towards strategy implementation, actually confounding. It may be a problem that's interrupting the implementation of the strategy. So the systems are meant to be guardrails. You have things like rules and tools, processes. The rules cannot be so prescriptive that they delineate every aspect of use of the system, because then your rules would overwhelm the system. But at the same time, they can't be so loose that they add no meaning to the system. They don't act as any guardrail. They're actually, rules are designed to be broken. If you think of it like the rules of a Monopoly game, you probably read them once when you were 12 years old, and now vaguely referred to them, but you say you're playing by the rules. It's the same with business systems. It's the same with strategy implementation. We have a policy for that. But very few people refer actually back to the policy. And so what you find in strategy implementation is these historic or legacy systems within the organization become a distraction from implementing the strategy because they're divergent from the strategic goal or the objective. So one of the things we'll come to here in a minute is just about alignment. As people interact with systems or processes, they end up developing routines in their practice. There's an assumption, again, in management that people's routines are correct, that you have a policy, you have rules, and therefore that's what the manager will do. And what's real is that routines are ostensive, what's meant to be done, the ideal routine, what was planned, but then the performative, what people actually do. And there's so often a disconnect between ostensive routines and performative routines that the performative routines, what people do, will have an impact on the strategy implementation because they, again, make assumptions about what the strategy's intent was and the planning context, and then the performative routines actually become the defined routines, the real, and the rules and policies and norms form around what people actually do. So if you have divergence between your strategic goal and also operations, that divergence may end up perpetuating because it becomes routinized. So the holy grail of strategy, it's about alignment. You have heard this all through the 80s and 90s and 2000s, strategy alignment. We're going to get alignment. We're going to cascade our strategies and they're going to align. And alignment contemplates rules and policies and procedures and norms and processes that they are all acting in concert together. And alignment at the formation stage is often assumed. And operationally, there's often misalignment. And so one of the key things to do in strategy formation is as you shift from formation implementation to confirm that there is truly alignment, that the systems are aligned, that the motivations are aligned, that the communication is aligned, that the goals are aligned. And so that people have that sense of alignment. The rules, policies, procedures, norms, they all contribute to achieving the strategic objectives. Very often, organizations will make a strategic plan and do nothing about updating their systems, updating their policy, updating their norms. Let's see, we're 50 minutes in. I'm going to skip over my example of an apple. The systems become boundary objects. A boundary object is something that spans multiple worlds. So an accounting system, we both understand that we have an accounting system, but the person who's formulating strategies contemplation of the accounting system actually is quite different than the operator's use of the accounting system. And so that boundary object, we use the same word, and Janice, I'm looking to you, words matter. We use the same word, and then we assume that we have a shared understanding of the same word, even though we're thinking of different things. And so back to my apple example, if I ask you guys to picture an apple, there's 40 people on the call, we'll probably have at least 10 different colors of apples, 10 different flavors of apples. And yet when we say apple, we assume a shared understanding. And so, sorry, I just have to get back to there. The premise of understanding is going to be how we make sense of the context of the information we have available. And we go through a set of steps. We organize the data, we notice certain things, we bracket and just don't notice other things. We create meaning from things, we make interpretation, we label it, and then we identify and classify it. So back to the gates, plausibility and identity affect sense making. That means that how I think of myself and my abilities, if I identify as an accountant, things that are in an accounting system will affect how I make sense of that context. Plausibility, if I think it's real, I will be more likely to accept it. But our sense making is not static. You don't make sense of something once, put it into your memory, and then leave it alone. You make sense of it on an ongoing basis, and it's continuously updated. And of course, meaning is classified as related to other meanings. So as you gain experience, you shift and redefine your meaning of something. So I might learn something, store it in my memory, and later on when I retrieve it, when I'm retrieving it, it's going to be contextualized based on my new understanding and other meaning. So, translation. Janice left, but I was going to point out for her, this is it. We often assume objectivity in meaning making, but actually interpretation is contextual, and that when we store and retrieve information, they're all subjective, and each time we communicate them, we're creating shared meaning, and that shared meaning is intersubjective. It's subjective between the two of us, and again, that new meaning will influence all of the other meaning I have related to that topic. So what you can see is that, I'll skip this one. What you can see is that as middle managers engage with strategy, they're going to interpret the strategy, frame it, they're going to work with others and make sense of it for themselves and give sense of it to others. Then they're going to store it. Then they're going to later on retrieve it and recollect from it. It's all going to create routines, and that each time I'm going to interpret it, I'm going to reinterpret it based on the new context. So when I talked about the planning context, the reason I say it's so important for people to understand the basis or the rationale for why a goal was selected or why a strategic position was selected is because the closer they are to understanding with a common understanding, the basis for strategy, the more likely that they are in the interpretation and reinterpretation, it will be close to what was intended from the strategy design. Just looking at the same things, each time you do interpretation, you have situated learning. In framing, you make use of boundary objects. And then, of course, as you sort and recollect, you apply the contextualized rules that you've been working with. So, kind of summing up the human interaction with strategy. Strategy is socially constructed. Systems are inherently limited. Context matters, and people are not perfect. Strategy implementation is not a linear process, and the closer you can get to a simple, clear, shared understanding means that you'll have better likelihood of it being able to implement your strategy. Elegance isn't in complex designs. Elegance isn't in having the really cool strategy. Elegance is in your strategy is implementable. I'll just very quickly just rip through the next part on monitoring, and then I'll take a couple of questions. So reporting and monitoring. So when you've identified your strategic goals, you'll want to have things that you're monitoring for in the external environment that are contextually relevant to your strategy implementation. So if you said we're depending on the release of a new technology from Microsoft, and you need that technology for you to do your next thing, then you have a priority information requirement for when that happens. When we talked about reporting, it's important that you align the reporting elements to the strategic objectives. So that's the logic gates that we talked about. When you're reporting progress, it's important that you report progress towards the targets or goals that you've set based on your planning assumptions. Your reports should be specific enough that they indicate whether or not you're making progress towards your goals. Your key performance indicators or objectives and key results should be related to the strategic goal that you want to do. So I talked earlier about the elements, about what will we do for who, when will we do it, how much will it cost. So those are elements that you'll want to report on strategic progress. And then, of course, you'll be familiar with the balanced scorecard perspectives, the financial perspective, customer perspective, internal process, and learning and growth. And just remembering that in not-for-profit organizations, you might flip customer instead and have financial just as an enabling measure earlier on. So just to say that it's important that your reporting actually links back to the systems that you're using to support strategy implementation, but also link back to the specific goals and objectives. Performance indicators. So context matters. These are some pitfalls that are often overlooked. People try to use a single KPI to convey a whole lot of information, but there's in doing so, you miss some of the richness. So for example, context matters. If you have a 90-day billing cycle where you do payments on 90 days, we'll just use 30 days. 30-day payments. So you buy supplies on January 1st and you pay for them on January 31st. Your fiscal reports for January on cash flow are going to look pretty good because you didn't pay anything for the things that you bought. And then at the end of that period, there'll be a big jump and you'll say, wow, this report doesn't make any sense. We just had a huge jump in spending, but actually it's just the billing cycle or the payment cycle, not the spend pattern. So context matters. It's important to understand what's behind the metrics. Often people use static indicators. That's indicators that don't really move, or they move only in a big step. So, a quarterly report of injuries. Well, if you're monitoring it monthly, it's not going to be very helpful for the first 2 months in the quarter. Lagging indicators, some of them may be too late. And so looking at performance towards your strategy, sometimes there will be key information that you may not notice until after a window of opportunity is missed. A proxy measure, usually proxy measures are sort of a measure that indicates performance towards a goal, but it doesn't necessarily tell you all of the sub-elements that contribute to that. And then same with this suite of measures. In a suite of measures, it's very easy to game both the numerator and the denominator. So you have to be careful that your reporting actually makes sense and provides decision-grade information. And then the last one that's kind of a major pitfall is if you use aggregate data, it's very easy to hide the detail that's relevant. So, maybe my performance is rated at 95%, but maybe the 5% that I've missed is the critical performance for one customer, and I've completely lost that customer. So just to say, be careful in how your data is presented and rolled up, because there are some pitfalls. And then looking at reporting, as you've finished with monitoring reporting, it's important to realize that your strategy is not on the shelf. You need to take the results of those reports and reevaluate. Was there a change in the planning assumptions? Was there a change in the planning context? Is there something that's different in how we made that strategy? Because you might have to change your strategy. If your results don't match your strategy, you might have to change your strategy. You shouldn't just assume that the results are bad. Sometimes the strategy is bad. And so sometimes you have to ask, is the different result related to a problem with the formation? And does the strategy need to change? If so, how? And so that's why I talked about strategy being a living activity. Just to sum up, excuse me, we covered the 4 stages: planning, formulation, implementation, and monitoring. They all need to fit together. My conclusions. With strategy, slower is faster. Really, it's important to take time to build a shared understanding. Your strategy is a best guess. Don't presume that it's correct, that it's infallible. You need to understand the drivers and motivations, how middle managers will make sense and interact with systems. That will greatly influence how you implement strategy. You need to explore boundary objects beyond superficially. You have to inquire, does your HR system support the HR strategy that you've got? Does your finance system support the strategic goal that you have? If the systems that people are using to create shared understanding and meaning are mismatched to the outcome, you will fail. You need to be curious about meaning and context. You should revisit your planning assumptions every time you get a report. Is this consistent with our planning assumptions? And then you need to test for materiality. If it's not similar, should we change? Strategy is a journey and not a destination. Strategy does not follow a straight line. Sometimes organizations have perverse incentives or disincentives for managers to implement strategy. Like your bonus system might be dependent on an efficiency measure, and then you might be asking people to go through change. And so it's very rare that you would be efficient through change. Usually change is a little messy. You have to check to see if your systems have barriers that are impeding the strategy. Monitor, adjust, monitor, adjust, monitor, adjust, monitor, adjust. That one you can just keep repeating all day. That's the process of strategy. Monitor, adjust. Remember that the whole person comes to work, the manager who's going to implement the strategy, and they're not perfect. And so watch for things where it's a simple mistake. And I'm not talking about negligence or malfeasance. It's just sometimes people, they don't do a great job. So make sure that you have checks on the important things that in strategy implementation, if it's important, it's the thing that gets watched. And then with strategy, when you're looking at reports, trust but verify, because Ronald Reagan told me to. Trust but verify. Okay,
Claire, I've used almost the whole time. I will happily stay on for questions if anybody would like to. Somebody just joined. Oh, well, we can start. We can start off. I'm going to just pop this one up as we go through questions. Anybody at all, anybody who'd like to reach out to me and nerd out more about strategy, I absolutely welcome any contact, especially if it's nerdy questions about strategy. Hard questions, I'll defer to my friend William, who's on the call. But in any easy questions, just reach out to me. There's my LinkedIn contacts and my email. And I've been thrilled to be here with you today and really happy to take any questions.
Does anyone have any questions? William?
Oh no, this is going to hurt.
Well, good morning. Good morning, Michael. And good morning, Claire and everybody. Since you mentioned me, so of course I need to stick my hand up, right? I just kind of thought as I heard your long, great presentation, by the way, and thank you. But I'm just kind of thinking a lot of this depends on the shared culture or the dynamics, right? Because as you mentioned, as you're talking about all of these, I was thinking in certain cultures, like I've heard like those national cultures, like the French or the Spanish, that they really gear towards, like everybody almost on their knees bowing to the director general, those kind of culture. Then how do you get the feedback that you were mentioning and get all the participatory response that you would hope for from those who are further down the line, but who will be actually crucial in implementing your structure? Because they are not going to give you feedback. They're just going to follow your direction to the T, and they will be willing to prove, even though their action will be causing your strategy to fail, they will be there to prove that they follow every letter of the word.
Yeah.
Then how are you going to deal with those?
That's such a good question. And so, William, I mean, what we know is people's closest relationship, and people often report that the closest relationship they feel in the workplace is with their direct supervisor. And so you're right, in the case where somebody has that relationship with the direct supervisor, where they would not provide meaningful feedback or critique of the strategy or the strategic objective, then you're at risk that they'll blindly follow the goal, even if it's wrong. So in those cases, the role of the leader or manager will be to, or the person who formulated the strategy will be to they will have to wear both the red hat and the blue hat, the good guys and the bad guys hat, and they have to contemplate what would be the impact of the most likely impact of a change, the most disastrous, and think through what would be the impact of somebody blindly following this without providing any contextual information. How would we know? But William, it does make it a lot harder if you can't rely on the authentic participation of the people who are close, because they do have agency in all of that work that they do. So, I asked you only to ask easy questions. You asked a really hard question. My answer is, you're right. If you have a culture that suppresses engagement, using a method that demands engagement will not work. The problem with strategy formation and then implementation is it's a team sport. No one person in any organization can do all of it and successfully implement. So culturally, I don't know how to address that. Organizationally, I think it's important that you have specific conversation about understanding what does it mean and the meaning making to help really explore whether or not the strategy is implementable and whether or not it's aligned.
Thank you. I'll save the time for other respondents, just in case there are others who would like to speak. Thank you.
Okay, and William, I'm in Vancouver next week, so hopefully we'll get a chance for a visit and you can ask me easy questions.
Yeah, sorry, no easy question from me anyway.
Anyone else? I know that I did kind of try to get a lot of content in there and a few people have had to drop off, but is there anybody else who has a comment or something they'd like to share about either their experience of strategy or ideas about implementation? Questions? Oh, I've used up all the time. All right. Well, Claire, thank you so much for inviting me today, and thank you everybody who was able to join. Really, sincerely wish everybody the best for the holidays and a prosperous, healthy, and happy 2024. I hope all of you are successful in every endeavor and well. I hope everybody has a great holiday and sign off. Thank you very much.